Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 61. Today is going to be a continuation on the topic of last week's episode, which was being his lover, not his mother. The topic really being control and releasing it. And today is going to be what I consider an important intermediary step to being really great at letting go of control and ultimately being more of a lover, right? Being able to create a much more fulfilling, supportive, and authentically loving marriage. I talk a lot about releasing control in various ways and how important it is. But here's the really important thing to understand, that we don't actually have control anyway in our marriage, not over our adult partner, right? Like we might think we do, but we don't actually. It's always an illusion if we think you do, right? Sometimes our partner really might comply with us, right? Or they may let themselves be controlled kind of unconsciously or begrudgingly, meaning they may be making decisions to do what you want, even if they don't want to so much themselves, right? But as an adult, your husband is always able to do what he wants. He will always do what he wants. Sometimes that may totally be choosing to do what you want, right? But often it won't be, at least some of the time, it won't be. So you might want him to talk about his feelings more or bring up relationship issues or important topics more, for example. But no matter how hard you try to get him to do these things, he will only do it if he wants to for one reason or another, right? He might say yes, and he might start doing it, but it's not because you made him. It's not because you actually had control over that, right? And I know this for sure because I have tried over and over to control my husband's actions. Just doesn't work. He still does what he wants to do. And sometimes that's the things I want him to do too. So I think it can be really amazing to really understand that we simply do not have control. And all our efforts to have that control is for naught, right? Or it even ends up causing us and our husband more suffering. So those of us who tend towards kind of being controlling, and I'm not going to go into what exactly that looks like on this episode. Go back and listen to last week's episode for a lot more on that, because sometimes control can be subtle. You might not think you're doing it, but you likely are in some form, shape, or form. But so those of us, which is actually most of us, especially as highly sensitive people, I won't even go into why, but there is a little bit there of us we have a tendency towards some control. So we have our work cut out for us. The work of accepting what is instead of trying to force or coerce or get our partner into sort of the image of who he should be, like who we want him to be in our heads, right? In other words, we have our work cut out for us in accepting that we do not have control over him. Now, again, you might be listening to me say, like, you don't have control over him. And you might be like, yeah, I know that. But there's a part of you very likely that doesn't fully get that. If you ever complain, if you ever act critical, if you ever withdraw and give him the cold shoulder, if you ever are super people-pleasy with him or over-the-top caring, or you try to prevent him from having any feelings or getting upset, all of these are little aspects of where we some part of us, maybe it's like the lizard brain part of us, thinks that we have control over this other person. We don't. Okay, so again, go back and listen to last week's episode. If you're like, I totally don't think I have control over him. A part of us generally does. It's kind of innate in the human. So really understanding this, really getting in our bones that we don't have control over this person can feel really liberating, right? But realizing and surrendering to this fact can also feel kind of like a free fall. It can feel totally uncomfortable. It can feel terrifying because control is oftentimes a tactic we use unconsciously to try to prevent bad things from happening in our lives or make the things that we want happen. Right? It's a protection mechanism. Right? So control can feel like a lifeline, like our only way to feel some sort of agency in our lives, in our relationships. Of course, this is never true. Controlling others' actions, controlling others is not real agency, right? Our real agency, our authority over our own experience is always an internal one. It comes from the inside, right? But there's this illusion that most of us have that controlling others is the way to create what we want or keep ourselves safe, right? And so when we surrender that idea, it can feel like we're out of control, which we are. It can feel very uncomfortable. But really recognizing this and surrendering and accepting the fact that we don't have control of others is a profoundly healing step. And that will ultimately end up giving you more genuine influence and power in your marriage, and certainly more control over your experience of your marriage. So accepting this is an essential step towards gaining real emotional agency and influence in your marriage. So how do we do that? What helps us to truly surrender the illusion that we can control this other person who is an adult? I have found something that I haven't heard anywhere else that can help so much in this process, which is to grieve this loss of quote unquote power that you sort of thought you had, but now you see you never did. To grieve the loss of the illusion, right? We get to peace. We come to peace with the fact that we don't have control, right? Over others, their actions, their behaviors, by grieving the loss of the idea that we did. So I want to share a personal, vulnerable story of what this means and what this could look like. And I want to emphasize that what I illustrate in the story is certainly not the only way to getting to a place of acceptance, of surrendering the illusion that we have control, right? And it does not have to be as sort of intense and dramatic as my story or my experience that I'm going to share with you now was. It's often more nuanced, more subtle than this story illustrates. But it really can give you this story a sense of a process. And I'll share some more on that. Other suggestions on that after my story. And this is a story actually about my oldest son, not my husband, who will be 17 any minute now, probably by the time you listen to this episode. And so he's actually not an adult technically, right? But he's really at that age where he is thinking he is and getting to the place where I can't control him. Definitely not in the same way as like a parent can kind of control. I mean, and we can never fully control anyone, right? But be in charge of certain things he does, right? He's almost an adult. So I have recently had a kind of a wake-up call about my oldest son. And it's been about COVID. In our state, we've actually just been going through the very worst of the pandemic, at least in terms of cases and how pervasive it is around us. I actually live in Vermont, which was like the least COVID-y state until now. And so we also have a young son who has not been yet vaccinated. We've just been open up for vaccinations. So for his age group. And so for months, we've had rules for my older boys about like how they were allowed to socialize. And it was mostly outdoors. And my eldest, I recently found out, did not follow those rules. And he has been indoors in one like small room in various friends' houses with 8 to 10 of his friends at a time, like for months, unmasked. So without getting into more details, there were also some other things along these lines that have happened that's just made it super clear to me. I simply cannot keep him from certain things, right? I cannot control him. Right? I mean, I can create these rules. I can create consequences. He's still going to do what he wants to do. Right? I can't control him not to keep my family safe, not to make sure he goes to college, not to ensure my son has a healthy, successful life. Right? I don't have control of him. And, this all hit me in a deeper way than it ever has. And the day that this was really hitting me, this awareness created a feeling in me of like this very free-falling feeling, like I'm falling from a cliff experience, right? In other words, a sense of helplessness, right? So I noticed that day that I was very teary. It was a work day, but I kept feeling really sad around the edges. Never with my clients, of course, because I'm always just 100% there with them and not thinking about my personal life, right? But I was just noticing in general, these sad, helpless feelings kept creeping in. So I decided, as I teach, as I talk about with you all regularly, I decided to give myself the space to feel those feelings on purpose, to turn towards them. And one of the ways, there are various ways we can do this, of course. One of the ways I love doing this is actually by dancing to some really good music that stirs me up kind of emotionally and physically, right? And just letting my body express those emotions. So as I danced, I just let myself cry. I let myself kind of flail my fear and my sense of helplessness. I just let it move, right? And after a few minutes of that, what I noticed was left was just grief. The grief of my son not being under my wing anymore. The grief of losing what I thought was control. And as I let myself feel that and cry about it and move it, let it just move through me, I had the experience of kind of being washed clean and left with a sense of way more peace. And as I did that, what I felt so clearly emerging alongside that grief was the desire for my boy to be well, for him to have the best life possible, right? And alongside that grief really was love, right? Love that came up so strong, love that was really the bottom of it all. So when I felt that, it freed me to actually be in touch with where I have influence in my son's life and in my experience with my son. So this is what I want you to know. Letting go of control does not mean you do not have influence. It doesn't mean you don't have influence in your marriage or with your partner. And it definitely doesn't mean you don't have influence over your experience of your life and your love life. In fact, again, letting go of this loss of illusion, of control, is the path to more influence, real influence, right? Not illusory control, right? And one of the best paths to letting go of that illusion, of that control, is to let yourself grieve. Grieve it. Because grieving is so powerful, as in my example, right? It's so healing. Grieving, what we're losing, is actually a form of what we call positive disintegration, meaning letting old ways, old ideas, old things die, so better new ways can be born, right? It's kind of like positive disintegration is like darkness that we move through in order to get to the new day, right? The birth of something new. So grieving helps us let go and release what is no more or what isn't serving us anymore. And it helps us make peace with the reality of what actually is, right? Instead of uselessly fighting what is. It helps us to see clearly what matters to us and connect to what is really true. And in the case of letting go of of control of our loved ones, grieving lets us really feel our love for them, our desire for goodness for them, and our desire for goodness for ourselves. And it connects us to the love we want to feel in our marriage. Because grief is only there because of our love for our partner or because of our love, for feeling and having love. In other words, grief connects us back to love. It kind of like pushes and clarifies, like pushes all the other stuff away, the less essential things, and boils our knowing, our attention down to just the what is at the bottom of it all is this love of love, this wanting to love and be loved, this wanting to be well with your partner. But distills everything down to love and puts that love like squarely in the center of our hearts, our mind, body, heart system, right? And from that place, we're really freed up to recognize where our influence actually is for our own selves, for our loved ones. So we'll dive more into specifics of that in a few minutes. But let's first talk about how do we grieve and release this false sense of control that so many of us have. And I'm just going to offer one way to do this, right? There's so many ways, but this is kind of a fun way you can explore, sort of a practical way you can move in that direction. And you might need to do this more than once, like as control starts to creep back in, right? Like it's not like always a once and done thing. As you've heard me say, I'm a recovering control addict, which, it just means I'm ongoingly working with this part of me that wants to step in and try to control things in my marriage or with my husband, right? So here we go. This is what I suggest you do. Actually sit down and make a list on a piece of paper of the things you want your husband to do and you've been trying to get him to do, right? So again, you might re-listen to last week's episode for hints on this. I go into more depth on what that might look like. And then I want you to look at that and to see that you do not have any control over that, right? You do not have control over how long he'll live, right? Even if you can cook him healthy food all the time, right? You don't have control over whether he cleans the house or puts his shoes where they go. Not whether he comforts you when you're sad, right? Not whether he comforts you effectively, right? Not whether he talks about his feelings. Not which emotions he feels, right? You don't have control over whether he feels happy or mad or depressed or stressed or triggered. Not whether he says, I love you or touches you the way you want. You don't have control over whether he puts down his phone in the evenings and spends time with you, or whether he remembers how to fix your child's dinner the way she likes it or not, right? Not whether he thinks positively or pessimistically, or talks to you in a kind tone, or talks to you in a snarky tone, right? These are things you do not have control over, and the list could go on miles long, right? Now, I want to remind you, he may absolutely find his way to wanting to do many of these things. He might already want to do and choose to do many of these things, right? And you can always express what you want. Again, like, hey, I'd love it if you ate healthy, or if you didn't eat so many Snickers bars, because I worry about your health and I want you to live a long time. I've said things like this to my husband. Hey, I really want you to be around for a long time because I love you so much. So when I see you eating peanut butter cups all the time, I worry. Would you be willing to eat less? And he might be like, no. Or he might be like, of course. I totally want to stop too. And I want to be around and eat healthier for a long time. I said that funny, but you know what I mean. Right? So you can always express what you want with good communication, respectful communication, and with requests. You just can't make him not eat the peanut butter cups or think positively or feel happy, right? That's his job. All of these things are his domain, his choices, right? Okay. So once you have this list of the things you want him to do and you've been trying to get him to do, just look at this list and see how attached you are. See how much you want it. Want these things. Right? And just actually let yourself feel what that feels like. Really let yourself feel that attachment, that desire for these things to be this way. And then, kind of just like I did a minute ago, say to yourself, I can't control any of this, right? Not whether, and then fill in your blanks, fill in your list. Not whether he, says I love you a lot. Not whether he looks at the phone, whatever the things are you want him to do, right? Not whether he's depressed or not, right? And once you've done that, you can symbolically, for fun, rip it to shreds or burn it. Burn this list that you've made. And for some of you, this might feel just freeing and liberating. And for some of you, it might feel really weird. And for some of you, you might start to get some access to that sadness, right? The loss of this control that you thought you had somewhere in you, even if you didn't think logically or intellectually that you had it, right? Right. So just letting yourself feel the loss of that control, feeling as sad as you do. You don't need to force it, right? And it may be that you don't feel sad and later on something goes on for you where you do feel that urge to control. And then you remind yourself or remember that you do not have the control. And that might feel sad or it might feel scary, right? Which we'll talk about next week. But, just like me with my son, at first I felt really helpless and kind of like, I was falling from a plane in the sky or something, like totally out of control and powerless. And then I just let myself feel the sadness of it, which was sort of below it all. And if you really sort of enter into the heart of that grief, you'll notice that love is contained within it, right? At its essence, there is love. And without belaboring that, I just invite you to kind of explore that. Like, is there love here? You can ask yourself, in this letting go, in this grief, is there in this really a desire for things to be good and well in your marriage, for your partner, for yourself, right? And notice how that is love. That is you wanting love and loving love. Okay. So once we've done some real grieving, some real accepting, and we are back in this place where we have actually landed in maybe a totally new place of just more cleanness, more clarity, more connection to that love, right? We can actually start asking ourselves, where do I have influence here? And I'm going to give you a hint of where you do have influence, which is your own emotions, your own way of showing up, right? You actually have influence over your emotions and therefore how you act, because our feelings lead to our actions, right? And being connected, therefore, to feeling love and respect and genuine care for your partner and yourself in your marriage, right? Feeling trust in your partner in your marriage and the love that's there, right? Like we talked about a few episodes ago in what I called Our Relationship is Fragile syndrome. That episode, it's a good one for if you don't feel like you have trust and feel like reliably like there's lots of love in your marriage. Go listen to that one. That will give you some ways to have that sureness and therefore have influence over how you feel and how you show up. Right? These states of love and respect and genuine care for yourself and your partner and your marriage, feeling trust in all of these things. These states are very influential states. When you are in them, you will show up and interact with your partner in a way that's very conducive to creating that environment that we talk about a lot, where your partner is most likely to, show up positively and lovingly and trustingly himself. Yeah. All right. So that's one question. Where do I have influence? Another really good question along these lines is, where can I be more of who I want to be? Right? Like when I asked that question about my son, when I was in this clean, clear place connected to the love that I have for him, my answer was, I want to be a mom who believes in my child, who believes in his capacity as a human to make good choices for himself, to grow and learn in the way he needs to. I want to be a mom who considers her child's mental, emotional health, his social life, allowing him his social life, just as much as she considers her family's physical health. Yeah. Two more questions that you can ask, right? So that you can have more influence is, how can I live and love how I'd love him to live and love, right? How I'd love my husband to. And what are my blocks to living and loving that way? What are the blocks to being the woman I want to be in my marriage? Once you have your answers to these questions, you can get to work on being that person and removing those blocks, right? Doing all you can to influence in a really loving, positive, respectful way, right? Which will, of course, include looking at the source of your fears that drive the urge to control and soothing those fears, which is what we're going to get into a bit next episode. So that capacity to influence first our own selves, right? To steward our own emotions, to show up in a way we want to show up as the partner we want to have, to be who we want to be, right? To love how we want to be loved, to overcome our fears so they aren't driving us. These are our greatest power of influence, right? Living from that place, modeling it. In other words, the most powerful control that we have in our marriage is our ability to take loving charge of our own internal life, our own selves. It is from there that the most potently loving experience of your marriage is born. When I say taking charge of your internal experience, your internal life, what I mean is knowing how to guide your thinking and your emotions so that you show up and take actions that benefit and contribute to the results that you want in your marriage. When my clients work with me, they learn how to do this deeply. They develop these skills so that they become innate. They no longer seem vague and mysterious. They're very concrete. And the result of this is that they experience their partner very differently. They feel so much more connection and love and so much less hurt and disconnection. And they notice their partner responding very differently to them. Much better communication, much more kind and respectful and loving attention and interactions. If you are ready to have this kind of power of influence in your marriage, come coach with me. I have spots opening up after the new year, so now is a great time to get on one of those consult calls so you can reserve your spot for the new year and give yourself the gift of a new revitalized marriage in the new year. To set up that consult call, you can email me at hannah@lifeisworthloving.com, or I will put the direct link to the scheduler in the show notes. Be oh so well.